let's get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. So for Team Cloud, in the Team Cloud corner, we have Jamie Fowler, the director of Atom IT. And in the Team On Prem corner, we have Julian Chesterfield, founder and CEO of Sunlight. Please, can you each give a brief introduction about yourselves and your companies? Let's start with you, Jamie.
Hi, everyone. Jamie Fowler, Atom IT. We started the business back in 2013, mainly supporting the education sector. Before that, a few of us worked for a local authority, going right back to sort of 2001. For John before that, and for Jonathan before that. So we've been dealing with schools for a long time, and I'm old. So yeah, we've been doing everything from primary right up to college, and we've done a whole host of work from your basic stuff right up to full network refreshers and hyperconverged infrastructures. So yeah, that's us really. So some of you on here that I know quite well already, and some new faces, so hello to anyone I've not met before. Over to Julian.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, so Julian Chesterfield, I'm founder and CEO of Sunlight. I'm coming from a technical background myself, so I've worked in cloud and virtualization technology in the industry for many years. One of the guys who wrote the Zen hypervisor originally, which was the technology that powered AWS and Oracle Cloud and a lot of public cloud infrastructure. So I've come from very much the kind of technology side of cloud and operations, and kind of understanding a lot about how that side of data center infrastructure operates and so on. Sunlight has been we've been around for about three and a half years now, and we came out of an evolution of many of the things that we've learned along the time in the cloud space, but we focus in particular on next generation edge on-prem infrastructure. And our focus is very much on where the technology roadmap is going in terms of next generation workloads, particularly video analytics and high performance applications that need to run at the edge.
Right, thank you both. So before we dive into the debate, for a bit of context for everyone here, it'd be great if you could tell us a bit about what you're seeing in school environments and some of the challenges that schools are coming to you with. So if you could start this time, Julian.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think the big change for everyone in the school environment in particular, and this is true in some ways across many industries, but particularly in schools, of course, was the acceleration of technology acquisition and a lot of the demands that came out of the COVID era. So really having to embrace remote learning and adapt technology solutions to be able to support that. I think we're kind of in this sort of transition phase where we've kind of gone through transition 1.0 of becoming more sort of online focused and being able to provide more services in a more flexible way. But I think there's a big change coming still, which is going to be the adoption of a lot of new kind of automation solutions and new technologies coming down the pipe as well. Which is why this debate is such an interesting topic. But I think it's going to highlight that thinking through these future proofing and forward planning is really going to be key. Jamie, how about you?
We see loads of things. So from very basic levels, we're seeing some schools that are still quite far behind on their adoption of technology. So their infrastructure is very, very what you'd expect, basic, around maybe a couple of servers, simple networking, nothing too complex. And I think that's going to cause challenges with the number of devices that are now being made available into pupils, and with the transition of certainly through COVID, with lots more devices and the anytime, anywhere learning, we saw a lot of infrastructure challenges, both cloud and on-prem. And some schools right up at the much more cutting edge, where they've had the foresight or the budget to build better, will have much better networks, much better internet solutions, and earlier adoption of cloud, especially on the Microsoft and the Google platforms. So it's really wide ranging, and I don't think there's a one size fits all yet.
Thank you both. Okay, so before we get started, I have a poll that I'm launching. It is about to go live now. So which of the following best represents your current infrastructure? Cloud only, on-prem only, hybrid, or other? We're going to leave this running while we go through the first couple of questions of the debate, and then I'll end it, so it gives you a chance to answer. Right. Question number 1. Is cloud or on-prem more suitable for the legacy workloads running in schools? Jamie, why don't you start this time?
So what we've seen with certainly from Team Cloud side of this argument is we've seen a lot of the legacy solutions move to the cloud quite successfully. We don't see many Exchange servers on premise, for example. We've seen that move into Google or Microsoft. We've seen Azure AD adopted quite a lot. We've seen MIS has migrated to cloud solutions. So they are absolutely the right way to go with some of those things into the cloud. We don't see a need really to have an Exchange server on-prem. Do you really need Azure? Do you really need AD servers if you can move to Azure and Intune? That's another question. So I think there's a good option to move to cloud for quite a few things now. There's always going to be some things that will be challenging, but not insurmountable. It's about why you want to move to the cloud and what is your strategy. What is your reasoning to go to the cloud rather than is it possible, I think. Julian?
Yeah, so I mean, I would agree with that. I think today, for a lot of, we're calling them legacy workloads, more traditional applications that would run in schools that people are using every day. A lot of these are not necessarily performance intensive. They don't necessarily drive a lot of bandwidth. So, I think, where it makes sense to be able to simplify the way that those applications are running, a lot of those do make sense, and they're probably easier to manage in a kind of a centralized cloud environment. I mean, there are a number of different applications that don't necessarily come under the sort of traditional IT bracket. I mean, things like security systems, door access control, CCTV, building management, those sorts of things, which of course tend to run on fairly discrete systems, and they're probably not generally thought about as part of the necessarily the sort of core IT function. But increasingly, I think we're going to see those becoming much more mainstream. But those are services and functions that typically do have to run on premise because of the mission critical nature of those. They have to be able to run completely autonomously. They always have to be on and up and running and so on. So today there's a bit of a mix, and a lot of the kind of fairly straightforward workloads. I think file servers, print servers, Active Directory, all that kind of stuff, Exchange servers. I agree with you, Jamie. I think it's probably easy to put a lot of those things into the cloud today.
Just to add into that, how we sort of run solutions in schools at the moment. Having everything in the cloud, not everything, but the majority of the infrastructure in the cloud makes a lot of solutions a lot easier. So, for example, we have an identity for a student or an identity for a teacher in Active Directory, which is synced to Azure AD. And then, mailboxes are provisioned in 365 and so on. But we also federate all of those accounts over to Apple School Manager and federate those over to Google G Suite as well. So there's single usernames and passwords for various services that schools can plug into for education purposes, but having all of that infrastructure within Azure AD, within a cloud directory, makes all of that possible. And you wouldn't be able to do that if you stuck solely with on-prem. So, you know, as an organization, you know, we have this debate all the time about legacy, you know, on-site, hybrid, or cloud only. So at the moment, there is a place for AD. It's easier to manage accounts in AD, there's no question about that. But there's more and more workloads within the sort of modern workplace and modern working environment that requires a lot of stuff up in the cloud now.
Thank you. Second question, is cloud or on-prem more suitable for the new workloads running in schools? So if you could start this time, Julian, with the on-prem angle.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think as I sort of hinted at a little bit earlier, I mean, I think there's a new breed of applications and technology that's coming. A lot of it, which is going to be based around, you know, automation of processes, things like, you know, IoT devices, sensors, and so on for, you know, smart building control systems, you know, switching lights on and off, controlling temperature and so on. But particularly the computer vision apps, I think, you know, we're seeing this across all industry verticals, not just in the education sector. You know, we do work, for example, in things like just walk out store technology, where you know, stores are starting to enhance the way that they automate processes. And I'm sure a lot of people have read about this, or even you know, experienced some of these stores where, you know, the vendors are, you know, instrumenting these physical locations with lots of cameras, and of course these cameras have to be really high quality. So in order to be able to run computer vision applications, you have to be running, you know, high quality video streams, things like 4K video quality, you know, which is, you know, every individual camera is going to drive something on the order of, you know, 30 megabits a second or so of high quality data. And for those algorithms to work, of course, you have to be able to process that data in real time. There are latency considerations around that. If you map that into a school environment where perhaps you're putting in safety systems where you know, identifying, you know, unauthorized people coming into a school environment, or perhaps it's being able to track movement of students around a school, of course, in an anonymous way, but you know, that data has to be processed on site. I mean, you can't be considering really, if you've got tens or even hundreds of these devices, you can't be transmitting all of that data up into a centralized cloud. It just becomes untenable, and of course, very expensive as well. So I think, you know, there are a number of factors that are going to drive requirements for, you know, some infrastructure on premise in order to be able to process these kinds of workloads. I mean, the other aspect to consider, of course, is, you know, high availability, and you know, in particular, you know, some of these systems have to be able to run autonomously on site, and that's really, you know, a key consideration as well. Yeah, Jamie, what are your thoughts?
I think it's difficult. There's new things coming and being thrown into the mix all the time. So what we've seen recently with advances in CCTV, with loads of online applications that schools are using now. There are things like TT Rockstars, or they're having Mathletics and so many other things that they need that, you know, run quite comfortably in the cloud. It's a case of what is it that schools want, what is it that schools need, and some of these solutions are cloud only because they are fully hosted applications. They don't give you a local install version. So I think, yeah, there's some things that really can only go cloud if you're going to adopt those technologies. But as Julian says, there's some things that, you know, you're not going to be sending 4K video streams from multiple cameras to the cloud and expecting it to be processed in real time. But there's other things that are much less data intensive that are coming around that quite happily sit in the cloud. So I suppose it gets down to the picking the right tools for the job, really.
I think when we're talking, especially to bigger schools around infrastructure and local network infrastructure, then it's, your mind is always, as Julian was pointing to, future things that are coming along. You know, there's lots of VR stuff that's coming down the line, holographic stuff, augmented reality, which is going to require on-site management. That can't go through the internet. It just doesn't. So there's going to be solutions that are going to require on-site infrastructure. So whenever we're talking to anybody about, you know, the latest breed of switches or whatever else that's going in there, it's with a mind to knowing that there's going to be a lot of local network traffic still going to be around for years to come. It's not everything can go to the cloud. There's going to be a lot of workload that's done on prem for the foreseeable future. We just don't have the infrastructure to move any of that off anyway, really, yet.
Yeah, and such things like esports, we're seeing schools now getting more involved in esports, and some of those will quite happily lend themselves to a cloud solution. You know, you don't need 3D graphics rendering on-prem if all you're doing is playing Minecraft. But if you've got more intense things happening, then that's not going to work with the cloud. So, as I said earlier, it's picking the right tools for the job.
Thank you all. Now I'm just going to end the poll that's been running. We're just taking a short break from the debate, and I'm going to share the results. So it looks like the vast majority of you currently do have a hybrid approach, and 18% on-prem only and 5% are cloud only. So thank you everyone for that. I'm going to launch a new poll now, and then we'll leave that running one as well. So next poll. Hopefully you can all see that. So are you planning to change your infrastructure approach in the near future? Yes, in the next 6 months, next 6 to 12 months, in the next 12 to 18 months, or no, I'm happy with my existing infrastructure. So I'm going to leave that running and we'll carry on with the questions. So question 3, which is more, these are going to be quite quick fire questions, okay? So because we've got a few of them to come. And so which is more secure, cloud or on-prem? So Jamie, why don't you start?
Security is the buzzword of the moment, isn't it, really? We're all into a bit of cyber. And I think there's a lot of risk management and risk aversion by moving to the cloud. Microsoft, Amazon, Google aren't going to want to risk losing their infrastructure for any long periods of time to a security breach. Not saying it can't happen, but they've got teams of thousands to put that security in place. Now, you still have to mitigate that risk. You still have to configure it correctly. Ultimately, we all see in the Microsoft T's and C's, even up to 365, that says we're not responsible for your data. All we're doing is providing you a platform, but they will provide you with the tools to do some security on there, especially if you're into Microsoft 365, A5, E5, A5, A3, A5 levels of licensing. Certainly A5 Microsoft Defender tools are quite advanced, but you have to configure them correctly. So you'll have a level of security up there if you configure it correctly. And that's always the key. Is it configured correctly? Are you managing it correctly? Are you monitoring it? It's not a case of I'm in the cloud, so my risk of security is gone now. I'm not going to get breached. You still could. You've also got the weakest point of every system, your users. So whether that's on-prem or in the cloud, you've still got users that can hand out passwords or get socially engineered or all the rest of it. And if they've not been configured correctly, you've given them too much rights. We've all seen the odd teacher somewhere that have been given very high level rights for whatever reason, and they get breached, and then they can do all sorts of damage through no fault. It is their fault they've got breached sometimes, but not malicious, I suppose is the right word, but it can still happen. So there is an element of security by going into the cloud and an element of risk management by going into the cloud, but it still has to be configured correctly.
And just to add to what Jamie says, it's all down to configuration. Everything, you can lock something down to the 100th degree, but it has to be configured correctly. And any undoing in any organization, whether it's a school or anywhere else, is misconfiguration or processes that don't meet any security requirements. I mean, I'm thinking of the most recent school that I know had a problem with losing all of their 365 data was because a disgruntled member of staff left and their account was left active. So that's a process failure. It's not a failure with the platform or the security abilities of the platform, but it's a breakdown of process and configuration. And that's the same as it's ever been with local, Active Directories, how they were configured, no different. There's just more security in the cloud that has to be done correctly. I mean, we see in schools a lot of teachers use personal devices for accessing school data. There's quite easy configurations in Azure conditional access to lock that all down, but it's processing configuration. If that's not been identified and put in place, then you're leaving yourself open. But that's the way it's always been.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all the above. I mean, security is only as good as the weakest point. And I mean, I'm a low-level systems guy, and when I think towards managed cloud environments, there's this sort of perception, of course, that outsourcing that it's going to be managed properly and carefully by your hyperscaler provider, if that's Microsoft or Amazon or whoever that may be. At the end of the day, you're always exposed to all sorts of vulnerabilities. We've heard a lot about CPU flaws over the last 12 months even, where these issues with things like memory side channel attacks, which can be executed by effectively any workload that's running on a multi-tenant platform. So you have to factor those kinds of risks into your your risk profile, I guess, when you're making a decision between the two. Now, of course, on-prem infrastructure is equally as vulnerable to those kinds of flaws. But one of the differences you have, of course, is that you do understand the parameters. So you have a much clearer understanding of what the workloads are that's running in that environment. You know who the tenants are on that platform, and generally those are going to be trusted environments and trusted apps. I guess there's also to some extent, and it's dangerous to lull yourself into a false sense of security. I mean, there is some protection, I guess, in having a kind of a private network address space that you would typically have, of course, on-prem, where you have perhaps more control around the perimeter of your environment. Although, as Jamie and John have said, if an attacker does really want to get access into your environment, the weakest link typically is going to be the end users. They're the ones who are most vulnerable. It's not that hard for somebody to accidentally download some sort of Trojan application that's ultimately going to give someone remote access into whatever that user has access to. There is no simple solution to this. I think the answer is whether your workloads are running in the cloud or whether they're running on-prem, you still absolutely have to maintain very strict security policies. You've got to keep things up to date and monitoring the configuration, making sure that everything is and doing vulnerability testing as well, of course, is really key.
Right, thank you. So next question. So which is more reliable then, cloud or on-prem? So Julian, why don't you start this time?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a perception that, of course, outsourcing into the cloud gives you a higher level of reliability because, effectively you're outsourcing this to, professional data center operator who's going to provide, high availability and fault tolerance and all of these good things. One of the things I'd highlight, of course, is that, creating high availability policy in the cloud is not always trivial. You have to understand what your policy is, what your tolerance to risk is, and of course that's depending on how much tolerance you have, the more the less risk you want to take, the more you have to spend on cloud infrastructure in order to provide that. But understanding about things like your failure tolerance to whether it's single hardware failure versus tolerance to availability zones within the same geographic region, or whether you need to distribute your failure tolerance across different geographic regions and so on, or even across different cloud providers. All of these come with challenges around how you manage that. For the on-prem case, as a minimum, of course, in order to make infrastructure easier to manage and to provide those kind of high availability guarantees, you need to have a robust and ruggedized HCI stack. We refer to the hyper-converged edge, which is very much our focus, and that's sort of bread and butter. So you've got to have that ability to create high availability policy for workloads that are going to run there. But I think equally you need to think about the disaster recovery policy that you want in place. So having some sort of hybrid solution where you're taking backups of data such that you can restore workloads into different locations is really key. That's something that we build into our stack. So our focus is very much on remote distributed site management from a centralized dashboard from a console that runs in the cloud. So being able to kind of tie sort of best of both worlds together, I guess, leverage cloud infrastructure when you need it in a failure scenario, for example, but actually, put the workloads where they need to execute at the edge is also a key property. How about you guys?
That covers a lot of both sides of the fight, really. Certainly with cloud, you look at, if you're using 365 or you're using Google, you're going to get 99.999% figures quoted at you for uptime and reliability. And we know Microsoft have got multiple data centers and fault tolerances and resiliences built into all the data centers. So you'd expect a good level of reliability. But as Julian touched on that, DR is a thing. If your tenant gets destroyed for whatever reason, malicious attack, or there is the chance that 99.999%, somebody wins the lottery levels of win, can take that out. What are you going to do? How are you going to continue to work? Having a DR plan, really, no matter how reliable you think something is, what is your plan for when that reliability inevitably isn't reliable? And I think we talk very simply when we talk cloud most of the time around the Microsoft 365 piece or the Google piece, but maybe you are running servers in Azure, and what is the reliability of those if you need to take them down, or it's still ultimately moving an OS into a cloud. How reliable is the operating system if you run a patch, or you run Windows updates, or you update an application and it causes a fault? Is that still going to be the same as being on-prem? Of course it is. It's still Microsoft at the end of the day. It's as reliable as Microsoft allows it to be. So yeah, it's not an easy question to answer. So have DR.
I've heard of DR, disaster recovery, also being referred to as disaster replication. So you have to make sure that it's also having snapshots of data prior to failures, updates that cause instability and things like that.
All right, let's move on to got two more questions. So and we have Q&A. So let's try to be quick fire with the last two as much as we can. I know it's a hot topic and there's a lot to say. So which is more cost effective, cloud or on-prem? And that's over to you, Jamie.
I think I've said this several times and will continue to say it. If you're moving to the cloud to save money, you're not doing it for the right reasons. You should be looking at is it the right solution, not just from a cost point of view, because sometimes moving to the cloud can be cost effective. Again, in education, using the Microsoft 365 or the Google Workspace stuff, that covers a lot of it. If you need to start spinning up servers in Azure or AWS, you need to get a calculator out and work out what would the cost be of running this in Azure or in AWS or wherever else you want to spin it up. compared to if I kept that on premise, what would the cost of buying that physical piece of tin be? So you've got to look at both. You've got to weigh it up and work it out, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I think, you have to remember that, cloud economics work on, economy of scale and overcommitment of resources. So if you're deploying workloads that aren't particularly IO or processing intensive, and you can benefit from those economies of scale, then there are clear models where cloud is going to be more cost effective. As soon as you start scaling up those requirements and you look at the pure unit economics of buying cloud services versus the equivalent on-prem infrastructure with the same processing capacity, you're going to be paying a massive premium on cloud resources. I mean, I always think a good exercise is to if you look at AWS pricing, which is all public and it's all open. If you look at the cost of bare metal services in AWS, it gives you a very clear comparison point against equivalent server infrastructure that you might be deploying in another data center or on prem, for example. If you take just a standard bare metal instance like an i3, for instance, you'll be paying something on the order of £3,000 a month, which works out at like 36,000 a year, which is significantly more in 1 year than you would spend on hardware infrastructure itself. So I think that gives you a really good indication of the cloud economics. What you're paying for in that case really is the outsourcing of the infrastructure, the management, the monitoring, high availability, all of these things that take resources and cost money for them to provide. So yeah, I mean, the answer I think is always, as you scale up and you consume more cloud resources, the answer is almost inevitably going to be, without exception, that on-prem is going to be more cost effective. But as Jamie says, I think there's a lot of factors to take into consideration, and you do need to. The biggest key, I think, is to really, and it's a hard thing to do, is to estimate. You may have an idea today of what it's going to cost you, but you have to try and estimate, how much is that resource consumption going to grow? What are the demands? Are you going to have, if your database is underperforming and you're going to have to pay for more CPU performance credits in AWS, for example, that's going to significantly put the cost of that infrastructure up.
I think also, there's also a distinction in the cloud side of things from public cloud and private cloud. Most school workloads are going to be done in the public cloud, the 365 platform, or using Microsoft Endpoint Manager to replicate what they do in Active Directory with group policies and so on. Same with Workspace, exactly the same. So there's a distinction made between private clouds and hosting, virtual servers to replicate what you're doing on site, or moving your workloads into Microsoft or Google tools that replicate those workloads in their public cloud, because obviously that's a cheaper alternative than hosting your own stuff. Is how much of your local infrastructure you can move into those public cloud platforms and solutions. So there's a lot of variables with this all. Yeah.
Thank you. Right, last question. Is there an argument for a hybrid approach, and what would that look like? I think this has been already discussed slightly. So Julian, why don't you start?
Yeah, well, I think definitely yes, for sure. And we've kind of I think the whole discussion has kind of validated that to this stage. There are certain applications and workloads that will run more instinctively and probably will be more cost effective to run in the cloud, and so particularly hosted services like Active Directory, Microsoft Exchange, online learning systems, and so on. They make a lot of sense to run those types of services and to leverage existing services in the cloud. I think that it's increasingly there's going to be more and more applications and workloads, however, that do need to run on-prem. And so I think having a hybrid management approach for workloads, as well as availability and backup for all of these solutions is really key. So yes, absolutely. And
yeah, I think hybrid covers most scenarios. There is going to be some cases where you can go all cloud, and there's going to be some cases where you want to stay on all on-prem, and there is so many factors to take into consideration. What level of knowledge and skills do you have in-house around on-prem compared to what you have for moving everything to the cloud? What workloads are you running? What do you need to have? Where's the best place for it to run? I think you've got to analyze it, not just decide I'm going cloud and be very blinkered and only go that way, or I'm going on-prem and again being very blinkered with your approach. You've got to look at all the options really. But I think most scenarios you are going to end up with some kind of hybrid approach, I think.
Great. So that comes to the end of the debate. What I'm going to do now is share the poll before we do a very quick Q&A. So hopefully you can all see the results there. Are you planning to change your infrastructure approach in the near future? It looks like a good 43% of you are happy with your existing approach, and otherwise within the next 6 to 12, 18 months, others of you are looking to potentially change your infrastructure. I hope that the debate has supported you with decisions that you might be making, questions that you have, but of course you have some experts here that I'm sure will be willing to support you with any further questions after the debate. So let's go to the Q&A. We have 5 minutes, so let's start. It's quite a long question. With budget set at the beginning of the year, how do you budget for cloud services where costs aren't quite so straightforward as buying physical hardware? As you're all in education, the budgets aren't typically flexible to accommodate costs based on IOPS, for example. This person is currently hybrid, but suspects they'll be pushed more to the cloud from their sponsor when it comes to a refresh server infrastructure.
That's a good question. I remember a few years ago, not that long ago actually, there was a local authority that decided they were going to try and take everything to the cloud, and then decided to shut the data center down, move to the cloud, and ran out of money after 9 months. They had to turn some of the servers back on. So you're dead right, it is difficult to budget because unless you've done some real in-depth calculations. And we've all done it when we've got on-prem hyper-converged or server-side infrastructure, and we're running virtualization, and suddenly we need another service spinning up because one of the IT teachers has discovered something wonderful that they need to share with the children, and it needs its own server. And it's dead easy when you're on-prem, and you can just spin the server up and go. Doing that, if you're in the cloud, what's the cost of spinning that server up in the cloud and running that solution? And then you've got to start working that out. And is that going to take you over your budget because it weren't budgeted for in the first place? And yeah, you're dead right. So no, there is no real easy answer for that one, I'm afraid.
And you always have to bear in mind the Microsoft licensing prices may change. There's no way of knowing what they're going to be within a year or two, what products they're going to be added into each of those license SKUs. You have no idea. I mean, you can go on a historical basis of what you think it's going to be, but you don't know. And with the events that have happened over the last few days as well, that just makes things more expensive when you're buying these services from global companies. There's no question about that, and that can go both ways. So it's the cloud way does give you some questions about what the cost of that's going to be going forward. Whereas on-prem, your cost.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it is hard. I mean, you always need to factor in that. I think performance is always the thing, and particularly IOPS. So storage IOPS is always going to be probably the most expensive component that you're paying for in the cloud. Because the cloud operators are smart. They know that, how your workload performs today isn't necessarily how it's going to perform in 6 months' time. Once you're kind of locked into an environment, it's hard to change and it's hard to move that. I guess the best approach is to, at least, spend a lot of time trying to profile, your existing workloads so you can get an understanding of, how it performs today, and then, try to estimate what you think the performance will need to be in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and, however far out you need to budget for that. But it's a really hard thing to do.
Okay, next question. This is about backups with cloud service. It's quite easy to back up to local tapes, offsite servers, particularly with regards to file servers with lots of data. How do you approach backups and cloud services and budget accordingly?
Well, I can jump in on this. From the Sunlight side, our approach is that we leverage backup providers. So, whether that's an on-site, like an NFS target, a local storage device, or whether that's a cloud storage service like S3 in AWS, we kind of leave it up to the storage provider to do obviously the replication of data and making that available. But the key thing with Sunlight is we enable the scheduling of backup. So you've got a whole bunch of workloads that are under management, perhaps on-prem in your cloud environment. But from your centralized dashboard, you can schedule and manage the storage of that backup data via that storage provider. S3 is probably the most common one that we see because it's relatively low cost and it's very well provisioned. So obviously they've built the service to be geographically distributed and optimized. So you'll always be communicating to the closest S3 object store endpoint, which means that you're transferring data with low latency and with kind of high performance as well.
With your 365 and Google platforms, there is loads of SaaS type solutions, software as a service, that can do those backups. There's Barracuda, there's Datto, there's ArcServe, there's Unitrends, loads of different ones that you can use. And most of them charge per user or per mailbox. There's other ways of doing it. With ArcServe, it's literally you pay for space. So, but it sounds a bit weird with ArcServe because you would back up to an ArcServe appliance on-prem. So you moved all your data into the cloud, then you back it back up down to your server room. Synology do the same sort of thing. You can buy a Synology NAS that will use a backup service that will back up your 365 or your Google tenant back to a NAS box on site. Again, sounds a little bit weird, but they're very cost effective because you're not paying per user. But then you've got to then think, right, I've now got a NAS or an appliance on-prem that I've got to secure and I've got to manage, and I've got power consumption and network consumption and internet bandwidth being used by that as well. So, but yeah, it's not. There's lots of solutions, but it's working out which one fits you best, really.
Right, we have gone over slightly. We have quite a few questions. Shall we just do one last one, and then for the others that have come through, including directly from the ANME, we'll get back to you directly, if that's okay. So let's just do this one last question, because I don't want to keep people too long. Are there any impartial studies that can show the cost savings that can be leveraged by moving to the cloud?
I'm not sure such a thing exists.
It's the word impartial that's difficult within that sentence.
It's very difficult to get an impartial one.
Yeah, there are so many variables. It's I think it's been touched on during the whole time. There are so many variables, so many different kinds of workloads, so many different kinds of infrastructure set up. MIS systems, users, on-site systems, cloud systems. There's so many of them that one study or a collection of studies isn't really going to address that. You know, you're talking about public cloud, private cloud, bits of private cloud, bits of on-site, bits of public cloud. There's so many variables. It's bespoke. It is bespoke. So your solution and your requirements are going to be different from anybody else's, and it's an exercise working with, you know, technology partners to help you look at the cost savings or cost implications of various solutions, and that's what we're here for.
Great. Well, seeing that was short, and we still managed to keep quite a few of you on the call, so webinar. Thank you. So let's just do this last one because I quite like it. How do you even begin to start doing AWS or Azure pricing calculator? This person's been on their website and has got stumped at the first step because there are so many services, 149 for AWS. And many more on the Azure pricing phrases. So the question is, how do you even begin?
The last answer that was given: work with a technology partner. It's, you know, if you don't know the answers to everything, just reach out and get help with it. I mean, I've seen I know exactly what you're talking about. The Azure pricing pages, huge, and you don't know what half of it even means, whether you need it, what it is, how you would use it in schools. So, you know, get some help, get some advice in there from people who've done it before. That'd be the best advice, I think, with that.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah, with that, if you were looking at bringing stuff into Microsoft, we would probably bring Microsoft to the table with it and say, go on, then tell us the right answer, because, you know, the answers change every week as well. That's the other thing. It might be 149 this week. Have a look next week. There might be 186. Yeah. I feel your pain there.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.